Hi, and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today I want to talk a little bit about what makes you sick. So disease is really any deviation from a condition of good health and well-being, right? And that, of course, is we say, oh, I'm sick, I don't feel good, I don't feel normal. Now, diseases can be divided into two big categories, that is non-communicable and communicable. And non-communicable is a disease that's not transmitted from one individual to another, and that could be a genetic disease like Huntington's or Parkinson's or something like that. It could also be cancer, right? Neither of those are communicable. They're not transmitted from one individual to another. We're not going to be talking about non-communicable diseases in this part of the course. We're going to be focusing on things that you can transmit from one individual to another. And we're going to be looking at contagious disease, right? So a communicable disease that is easily spread from one individual to another. Some things are really hard to transfer. It depends on what the vectors are and what your portal of entry is and how well they survive outside the body, things like that. So there's all kinds of things that allow a disease to be more contagious than others. And so what we're really kind of focusing on are going to be the things that are more contagious, okay? When we talk about these communicable diseases, we're talking about infectious diseases. They're diseases that are caused by the presence or growth of microorganisms or parasites. And we're going to be focusing mostly on the microorganism diseases, specifically viruses, bacteria, fungi, and protozoa. Although you have parasites, and then you have protein diseases like mad cow and Creutzfeldt-Jakob, which we are not actually going to be talking about those. Your parasites are going to be stuff like tapeworms and intestinal worms and all those good guys. But again, we're going to focus on these kind of four groups right here. So infectious disease can be caused by any of these things. Okay, so I just put this slide in here, so if you think to yourself, ooh, I don't feel very good, do I have a virus or a bacteria? Here are some of the characteristics of viruses and bacteria, so you can get a good idea, which brings us to our first mini quiz question. Infectious diseases are typically treated with antibiotics, true or false? Well, this is false, right? We just talked about you could get all infectious diseases from all of these different things, but antibiotics only treat bacterial infections. If you have a virus or you have a protozoa, you cannot take antibiotics for it and expect them to work, because antibiotics only treat bacterial infections, and that's really, really important. Okay, antibiotics are only for bacteria. One of the reasons that we end up with superbugs is because there's this idea that we can just take antibiotics for anything. And so the overuse of antibiotics, especially in situations where they are not warranted, has had some sort of negative consequences, which we'll talk about later. All right, so let's talk about some definitions. Pathogenicity and virulence are two terms that you need to know. Pathogenicity is the ability of a microbe to cause disease. Now, we use this in comparing species, right? So let's say that the lactobacillus that we made your yogurt with, that's not pathogenic, okay? But an E. coli may be pathogenic, right? And so we're looking at two different species. Virulence is how pathogenic is a microorganism, and we use those to compare strains within a species. There are multiple strains of E. coli that are pathogenic, right? Lots of E. coli are pathogenic. Some of them are way more pathogenic than others, so we call those more virulent than the other strains, okay? And so we're comparing the same species, yeah? Now, how virulent something is going to be is going to depend on a couple of different things. One, that's going to be the individual, the host of that microorganism, and so we're looking at the state of their immune system, and we'll talk about the immune system in just a minute. The other thing is exposure, right? The infectious dose. How many pathogenic cells has the host been exposed to? And that's a really important thing too. And you can think about these things in terms of poisons as well, which is interesting because these guys produce poisons too. Toxins like E. coli doesn't make you sick because of the E. coli. It makes you sick because of the toxin that it produces. But back to this idea of dose. It's really the dose makes the poison is something we say in toxicology, for instance, right? And so anything can be poisonous if you have enough of it. The same kind of thing for bacteria. I mean, the number of bacteria that you encounter, or viruses, or whatever, in terms of the number of cells, is really important. Okay, so what about infection? Well, you can have an acute infection or you can have a chronic infection. Acute means immediately, it's usually more severe. Chronic means long term, and it usually takes a while to develop. Okay, so those are two terms that we talk about. And then when we're talking about infection in general, there are a couple of stages. Now, before we talk about this, I just want you to know this generalized stages of infection is going to come up again later on when we're talking about something completely different, right? So you're going to see this model again. But first of all, when you talk about infection, you have to have some sort of portal of entry. So the pathogen has to enter your body. It has to colonize. That means it has to establish itself. This usually happens at the site of entry, not always, but a lot of times. Then you go through this incubation period. You have the pathogen in you. There's just not enough of it to make you show symptoms, right? So this is the asymptomatic period. You can absolutely be contagious at this point. And so this is kind of a dangerous period for disease transmission. You then move into the prodromal period, which is where you start having your initial symptoms. This is where the microorganism is in large enough quantities that your body starts reacting to it. Okay, then you have, or on a larger scale, then you have your invasive period. This is where you have an increasing severity of the symptoms. It could be characterized by things like fever, inflammation and swelling, sometimes tissue damage, depending on what kind of a thing is happening. Then you have the acme period, which is the period of the strongest symptoms. This is sort of the peak of the infection. Then the infection will begin to decline. Now, it's very possible at this decline of infection period, it's because the host dies, right? And so this is sort of, you kind of have two options here in the decline of infection. The infection can start going down because the body defeats it, or because the body dies, right? If the body defeats it, then you will move into the convalescence period, and this is the period of healing. If it doesn't, there's no convalescent because you died. All right. Now, your next question is, all bacteria cause disease. True or false? This is actually false, right? Not all bacteria cause disease, and we talked about that when we talked about pathogenicity. But remember, you have a whole community of microbes that live in and on you. This is your indigenous flora, and different organisms have different varieties, different amounts of microbes. If you were a ruminant, for instance, a cow, goat, sheep, you would have a much wider variety and larger number of microbes because you have that big ruminant stomach that allows you to digest grass. As a human, this is some of your resident microbiota, if you will, right? So this is your flora. So you've got some of those lactobacillus, that's what we make yogurt with. Look at that. You've got strep and staph and clostridium. Oof, those all sound really bad because we know that there are pathogenic versions of that. They're Candida, which is actually a fungus, trichomoniasis, which you have, that's also a fungus. These all have pathogenic versions of them, but they're also part of your normal flora. So most of the time, what you find is that lots of things you encounter are actually harmless, except under the right, or wrong for you, conditions, they can become pathogenic. So some of these guys that I just showed you, staph, strep, all of those, can actually become opportunistic and make you sick, right? These are some other things that you encounter that don't normally make you sick unless your body is compromised in some way, or your community, microbial protective community, is compromised in some way, because they do actually protect you. I mean, these bacteria really prevent other things from colonizing you. I would like to point out that none of these are viruses. None of your indigenous flora are viruses. Those are infectious. Yeah. Okay. Now, some of those pathogens have become, over time, drug resistant, which means that they are unaffected by the action of a drug. So you have Staphylococcus aureus on you. It is part of your indigenous flora. There is a strain of it called MRSA, which you have probably heard of, and this is a superbug. It's the methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, right? So they're the same species of bacteria, they're just different strains. This one happens to be pathogenic. All right, so what about resistance? Okay, you have three big apart like three big defenses. You've got your physiological defenses, which we'll talk about in a minute. You've got your chemical defenses, which we'll talk about in a minute. And you have your mechanical defenses. And your mechanical defenses are kind of your first line of defense, okay? This is going to be stuff like your skin, your tears in your eyes that also have antibacterial enzymes, your saliva, which has that, your respiratory tract has a bunch of mucus and little hairs in it, your urinary tract, the urine flushes out any sort of microbes that crawl up in there. So there are some immediate barriers that you have. Now, a physiological response, a fever is one of those, and a fever is an example of a negative feedback loop, a positive feedback loop, an evolutionary failure, since it can cause damage if it persists, or a huge nuisance. Well, fever is actually an example of a positive feedback loop. Lots of times in your body, you have these negative feedback loops that help you maintain homeostasis. Things like sweating. When you get too hot, you sweat and you cool off. When you get too cold, you shake and you warm up, right? But in some cases, you have positive feedback loops, and these are things that are unsustainable if they're continued, right? So fever is one of those things. You get hotter because you have more bacteria, and you keep getting hotter and you keep getting hotter. And that can actually cause damage over time, and you need to bring that down. Now, it is not an evolutionary failure just because it causes damage if it persists. If fevers persist, it means that you're actually not getting better, and so, you know, there's no shut-off trigger for it. But that doesn't make it a failure. It just means that, you know, it doesn't always work. But it works enough that is something that is successful. So what else goes with your physiological defenses besides fever? And I put this chart in here so you can kind of see, when do you start needing to seek medical help, when do you start needing to bring down that fever. Anything over 104 is really concerning. Yeah. Now, you also have inflammation, which has pus, and we'll talk about that later on, why that happens. And then you also have phagocytosis. You have phagocytes that will come and attack. These are little cells that will come and attack any sort of foreign material. You've also got some chemical defenses, stuff like lysosome, which is an enzyme that breaks down bacterial cell walls. You've got sebum, which is an oily substance that protects, it traps stuff in it like mucus does. You've got your gastric juices, which are highly acidic and have lots of enzymes in them. And then you also produce a chemical called interferon, which actually prevents viruses from replicating, which we're going to talk about in just a second. Which brings us to your immune system. The function of your immune system is to respond to disease and injury, and you have two big responses. You have your non-specific response and you have your specific response. The non-specific response is called innate immunity, okay? And this includes the exterior barriers that I was just talking about, that inflammatory response. And why do you do that? That is an expansion of blood vessels, and you get lymph, right? The lymphatic fluid in there. You get all of this extra fluid so you can carry all of these chemicals and cells to the site of infection. Okay, you also get a fever. The fever is there to heat up these cells and help kill them, but if it gets too hot, it starts killing your own cells, and that's bad. Those phagocytic cells, which were the macrophages and stuff like that, that go and attack, right? That's part of that non-specific response, and then those interferons that I talked about just a second ago. So anytime you get injured or invaded, this non-specific response is going to kick in with all of these things that it does, okay? But you also have a specific response, right? Now, first of all, I want to ask you another question. Why do organ transplants fail without immunosuppressants? The body doesn't recognize the organ as its own. The body is in shock from the surgery. Organs can't survive well outside the body and don't function as well. The doctors aren't very good. It's not the last one. The doctors are probably pretty good. Well, it turns out it's the first one. Your body has a way of recognizing anything that is its own cells. Every cell in your body produces a little chemical that says, me, I'm me, yay, right? So things come in other cells, and they have other proteins on them, and these proteins are called antigens, and it's those antigens that trigger a specific response. So an organ from someone else has antigens, and it will trigger that specific response, the acquired immunity. And what we do here is we produce lymphocytes, right? The acquired immunity, the specific response, is to produce lymphocytes, which come in two types: the B cells, which release antibodies, and antibodies will attack and link up with the antigens. This is part of your humoral immunity, okay? And unfortunately, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but you can see these little B cells, and they make two cells. They make the plasma cells, and those are producing antibodies, which will go and mark all these cells. They also produce memory cells, and the memory cells will stay in your body, and they will be able to recognize this antigen if it ever happens again. And that's why once you've been infected with something, your body will respond a lot faster the second time, because your body remembers the first attack. This is why you get vaccinated against things, so your body will have a faster specific response to stuff. That's what vaccines do. All right, and then the second type of cells are the T cells. Okay, these are killer cells. They will actually go and kill foreign cells. These are white blood cells. That will go and kill any foreign cell that contains an antigen. This is called cell-mediated immunity. And when you start looking at your immune system, here's that innate system that I was talking about with the physical barriers and the blood-borne barriers. This is why you have inflammation, right, by the way. And then you've got your acquired, which is also why you have inflammation, so these guys can get to the sites. Your T cell immunity, that's that cell-mediated. Your B cell, that's the humoral immunity, okay? You don't have to know all of these things. I just put this in here so you can see with the T cell immunity, you've got the death of the body cells that are infected with a virus or otherwise damaged. The blood-borne, and then the B cells, we're talking about the direct killing of bacteria. Okay, for the phagocytes, they cause the death of dangerous organisms, and the physical barriers will stop the infection before it enters the body. These 4 blocks are what I want you to really understand about each of these things, okay? So, on that note, which part of the immune system attacks cancer cells, right? Aren't those your own cells? They are your own cells. Well, a fever isn't going to attack cancer cells because those are your own cells, and the fever isn't supposed to kill your own cells. It's supposed to kill foreign cells that have a lower range of tolerance for heat. The B cells are looking for things that are not marked as your own. Cancer cells are yours, right? So what you really need in that case are the T cells, and it's the tumor-killing cells T cells that actually will attack cancer cells. And so your body does attack cancer cells. It just needs help. And that is, of course, not something we're going to be talking about. But your body does have some defenses against it, but they're not as successful as they could be, obviously. And then, of course, there's no defense. That's not true. Alrighty. So that is it about disease. The next set of video notes will be about medical geography and the transmission of disease, how diseases are transmitted, and then how we map them and what that looks like. If you have any questions, please ask in class, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.